Hey everyone, in today's video, I want to share with you how I've hacked my school's learning management system so that way I can implement standards-based grading in our gradebook. I've been working to implement standards-based grading for the last few years in my high school science classroom, but the biggest limitation I've had so far has been the gradebook that I am required to use with our school district. So I want to share some hacks, some tips that I've used with my particular gradebook to make it more standards-based grading friendly. Before we jump in, if you are really looking to move to a more standards-based grading system in your high school classroom, then make sure that you click the link in the description below, as it will bring you to a free guidebook that I will walk you through the steps for how to implement standards-based grading in your high school classroom. So the reason I ended up switching to standards-based grading in the first place was really that I was becoming really frustrated with just the process of grading and looking at the grades my students were earning in my class. The process of grading was always just a struggle for me because I was using a traditional points-based system where I would allot a certain amount of points for particular assignments. Depending on how many points I was allotting, kind of weighted it heavier or less heavy in the gradebook. So for example, tests would be out of 100 points, quizzes might be out of 30 points, classwork might be out of 10 points. And so when it came to grading, assigning particular questions a certain point value, or when I was actually grading someone's work, is this a -1 deduction? Is this a -2 deduction? I didn't really know what I was doing. And I felt like those numbers, those points, were just really arbitrarily assigned by me. And so I really felt frustrated by that. And then the other side of it was when I was grading student work, I noticed that students were getting pretty much all A's across my classes. And I knew that that was not a true reflection of what my students knew. If I were to have a conversation with a student about a topic, I felt like they definitely weren't at that A level, but their grades reflected A's. And what I was realizing is that kids were just getting really good at playing the game of school. They knew what they needed to do to get points. And although my tests and quizzes are weighted higher, the majority of my gradebook was classwork or homework, things where students had access to notes or had access to the internet or had access to other friends' homework assignments. And so because I was grading these out of 10 points, let's say, over time, enough of those assignments added up and really inflated the grades in my gradebook. And I really became frustrated by this. And I started exploring other ways of grading, and that led me to standards-based grading and more of a mastery sense of how to grade students. And so now, as I've been working to implement standards-based grading in my classroom, the biggest struggle I find is that the gradebook that my school requires me to use is not standards-based grading friendly. With standards-based grading, you grade per standard, not per assignment. A traditional gradebook is set up so that you enter one assignment with one grade, usually a number grade. In standards-based grading, you want to grade on mastery levels. So is the student mastering the standard or just meeting the standard, and so on, versus 95 points or 86 points. And so this is a major limitation to setting up your gradebook when it comes to wanting to be more standards-based. So I will, full disclosure, tell you that I'm not a true standards-based grader because I do have that traditional gradebook where I am required to give a student one single number at the end of a grading period or at the end of the course. So I have kind of like a hybrid standards-based grading system, but I have figured out some ways to hack that traditional gradebook to make it more standards-based grading friendly. So hack number 1. Because traditional gradebooks make you add assignments, what you want to do is make each assignment a standard. So if you have 12 standards in your class or 15 standards in your class, then you are going to have 12 assignments in your gradebook. And you're going to use one assignment per standard. So this would mean that, again, assessments are tied to specific standards. And so if you are only assessing in the first term 3 standards, then you would have 3 assignments, 1 for each standard. And there's a few different ways you could do this. So the way I've used my gradebook is that I'm only putting in the gradebook their most recent evidence of mastery on a particular standard, or you could do an assignment for every attempt on a standard. And so again, to keep my gradebook a little less clunky, I just keep 1 assignment for each standard. So standard 1 through 15, each has their own assignment. And every time a student is assessed on one of those standards, I replace their current level of mastery in that particular assignment. I keep a spreadsheet for myself that tracks their attempts, but in terms of the gradebook, I think it would get a little clunky because I might have 10 attempts per 1 standard times 15 standards. That could be a lot in the gradebook. So I just use 1 assignment per 1 standard. If you are like me and you don't want to overwhelm your gradebook by having every attempt in your gradebook, then some sort of spreadsheet might be helpful for you to track that growth over time. So every time you give an assessment on standard 1, you can see a student hopefully improving over time. And if this is something of interest to you, I do have a standards-based gradebook template already created in Google Sheets. So if you click on that link below, it will bring you to get that particular gradebook template. I strongly recommend it because it helps show that growth over time, and you can really look to see, are students improving? Are they maybe not improving? So if that is of interest to you, make sure you click on that link below. This second hack I have for you is that you would want to create a standards-based report card template. So because your traditional gradebook that you have to enter grades into, again, you don't want to overwhelm it and overclutter it with every attempt on every standard. So in my spreadsheet template that you can purchase, I have individual grade reports that you can then send out to students. So you can have students visually see their growth, their attempts at each standard over time, and hopefully see that they're either improving or maybe just staying the same or maybe even getting worse, which we hope is not the case. So by having these individual report cards, students can easily see which standards they need more help in, or standards that they're really getting, or standards that they're kind of all over the place. My third hack for you is to use words as much as possible in your gradebook over numbers. So you can use words in place of grading the standards by numbers. So for example, a mastery-based scale is generally the highest level is mastering, the second level is meeting, then approaching, then maybe not there yet. So you can use numbers 4, 3, 2, 1, but students are still familiar with that point-based system. So if they see like, oh, I got a 3 and it was out of 4 possible points, I have a 75. When that's not the case, when we're trying to communicate a level 3 is they're meeting the standard. So if you use words, you're less likely to have students getting confused by what their grades are meaning. Also, I like to use a category in my gradebook called tasks. So task will encompass any assignment that is not graded as an assessment, so it's not counting as an attempt on a standard, but rather it's to communicate if a student is completing or not completing the work that they should be doing in class or at home. So classwork, homework, any other sort of activity that we do that's not graded as an assessment, I still want to communicate to the student and the family that the student is doing it or not doing it. So in my gradebook, I grade all tasks using words. So if a student does a classwork activity, instead of giving them the traditional 10 out of 10 points, I am giving them the word done. So the word done, I have the ability to, in my gradebook, add grading symbols so I can type words up to 7 characters. So I use the word done with no point value tied to it to indicate a student has completed an activity. Same with homework. If a student didn't turn it in, I use the word missing. So it has no point value associated with it, but in the gradebook, students can clearly see all their tasks and how well they are doing with them. And then your first question might be, well, if it's not graded with a number, what motivates the students to do it? And I will tell you that by seeing in the gradebook the words done or missing. Students that are caring about their grades, they care about that, they don't want to see the word missing. I also make it important that if you're completing all your tasks, then you're going to have kind of a bonus opportunity at the end of the term to help demonstrate mastery if you haven't already done so. So I help motivate the students that way, that those tasks all need to say done to have this sort of extra credit opportunity at the end of the term. I also use the word incomplete. So again, my character limit is 7, so I just use the letters I and C. So if a student has turned a task in, they turned some sort of classwork activity in, but I felt like they could do more, they could give me more answer-wise, or they answered some questions but not all questions, I will use that grade INC for incomplete to also communicate that you are expected to do more or redo this or finish answering the questions that you haven't answered. I find that by grading with words over numbers, I'm allowed to have better conversations with students and parents about a student's grade, because oftentimes what I find is that students that are not completing tasks, so they have a lot of the missing word in their grade book, they are also the ones that are not meeting standards. They are in that approaching category or the not there yet category. And so by completing these tasks, by having everything say done, students are more likely to be meeting or mastering standards, because by doing those activities, they are learning. And that should help them practice a standard to hopefully reach that meeting or mastering level. So I can often say to a parent, yes, these assignments aren't factoring into their grade, but by not doing them, they are struggling to get to that meeting level. And this can be very helpful when having those conversations with students or parents. The fourth hack I have for you with making your gradebook more standards-based grading friendly is that you should enter some sort of preliminary grade that helps correlate the standards-based grades to a grade that they're familiar with. And so this might sound very anti-standards-based grading, but I will tell you, it makes things a lot easier. So with standards-based grading, traditionally, you only give the standards-based grades. So there should only be a grade per standard. And that should be either the 4, 3, 2, 1 or words like mastering, meeting, approaching, or not there yet. But with a traditional gradebook, I'm still required at the end of every grading period, as well as the end of the year, to give one number grade for the student for the course. And so what I want my kids to see is what each of those standards-based grades correlates to numerically as a letter grade. So depending on how many standards I've covered, in a grading period, I only have covered 4 standards. And so I want to, at the end of that grading period, look at those 4 standards and give one letter grade for that student for the course. So in my grade book, what I do is I keep one assignment called the preliminary grade. And I update this grade weekly based on their attempts at mastery and what their mastery levels are across all the standards assessed. So I like to use the 4, 3, 2, 1 system. It makes it a little bit easier for me in our grade book. So if a student has gotten a level 4 or they've mastered every single standard that term, they will get an A+. They will get an A+ in their grade book as their preliminary grade. But if a student is getting 4s and 3s, they're most likely just going to get an A for their preliminary grade. If they're mostly all 3s, they're in that B range. So I've thought about, if a student is mastering all their standards, they deserve an A. But if they're meeting most of the standards, they're in that B range. If they're approaching most of their standards, they're in the C or D range. And then if they're not there yet on most or all of the standards, they're in that F range. So I've come up with a little table where I can correlate the number of 4s, 3s, 2s, and 1s they have across the board to an actual letter grade. And so I keep that up to date weekly so students can easily see, oh, I got a level 2 on this particular standard. So now I'm down to a B or a C for my term grade at the moment. I need to make sure I go back and review that particular standard. So if I'm assessed on it again, I'm improved to the meeting or mastery level, and that should bring my term grade up. So it's a lot easier for students to see that one letter grade and understand how their standards-based grades correlate to that. The last hack that I have for you is to, in your gradebook, weight the standard assignments and the task assignments at 0. So what I mean by this is the only grade that we want to actually calculate for the students at the end of a grading period is that preliminary grade assignment. That's the only grade that they should have an actual numerical value associated with it. The standards assignment grades, as well as the tasks, should all have no point value associated with it. They are merely in the gradebook as form of communication about how a student is mastering standards, as well as how much a student is completing their work. So that preliminary grade should be the only grade that actually has weight to it in the actual gradebook. The other two should have a weight of 0. So depending on how your gradebook works, I know in mine, I set categories. So I have a category called standards. So each standard assignment I enter, so standard 1, standard 2, standard 3, I give them the standard category, and that category is set to be 0 weight. It has no weight whatsoever in the grade. It's merely there to communicate how well a student is meeting or mastering a standard. Same thing goes with tasks. All my tasks, so that includes classwork, homework, activities like that, that category tasks is set to have 0 weight in the gradebook. And then I set my preliminary grade assignment, that's only one single assignment in my gradebook, I set that to weight at 100%. That's the only actual numerical grade that calculates in their gradebook. So the tasks and standards are there as a form of communication, and the preliminary grade, which I enter and update weekly based on those standards grades, I then have that as the only thing waiting in their actual gradebook. If this all sounds super complicated to you, make sure you check out my blogs. I have multiple blogs on this sort of gradebook setup, as well as check out my TPT store, as I have resources that will help you with setting up your standards-based gradebook. I have that spreadsheet template that you could use to keep track of attempts on learning, as well as give students individual reports. I have the scale that I use to determine what an A is, what a B is. So check out those resources, and I hope they help you with setting up your own standards-based gradebook.